In the grim darkness of the far future, there are 1,000 ways reality can shatter like glass, and today's story begins with one of those impossible fractures. Picture this: while the galaxy burns in endless war, sometimes the universe itself decides to throw a curveball that would make even the chaos gods pause and scratch their heads. What happens when a wisecracking wall crawler from the 21st century New York suddenly finds himself face to face with the brutal reality of the 41st millennium? Well, buckle up for this wild ride through the warp. And if you're ready for more insane crossover tales from the Dark Millennium, smash that subscribe button. The Emperor protects those who support the channel. Peter Parker had been having what he'd generously call a rough Tuesday. One moment he was web-swinging through Manhattan, trading quips with the Rhino about his questionable fashion choices, and the next moment the sky had torn open like someone had taken a cosmic can opener to reality itself. Purple and pink energies swirled in patterns that hurt to look at, and Peter's spider sense went from its usual tingle to what felt like someone had plugged his nervous system directly into a car battery. Okay, that's definitely not the usual radioactive villain of the week energy signature, Peter muttered, desperately firing web lines to avoid getting sucked into what looked like a psychedelic blender having an existential crisis. But gravity, or whatever passed for physics when reality was having a mental breakdown, had other plans. The warp storm pulled him in with the inexorable force of a cosmic vacuum cleaner, and Peter felt his atoms doing things that definitely weren't covered in any high school chemistry textbook. Colors that didn't have names screamed past his vision, and he could swear he heard something laughing in frequencies that made his teeth itch. Then, with all the ceremony of a cosmic pratfall, Peter Parker crash-landed face first in what could only be described as the universe's least welcoming welcome mat. He peeled himself off the ground, which was made of some kind of dark metal that looked like it had seen better millennia, and immediately noticed 3 things. First, his red and blue costume was now thoroughly decorated with what smelled suspiciously like sulfur and regret. Second, the air tasted like despair with a hint of industrial-strength death. And third, something was roaring in the distance with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for apocalyptic monsters. "Well," Peter said, brushing off what he hoped was just cosmic dust, "I've definitely taken a wrong turn somewhere. This doesn't look like Queens, or Earth, or any dimension where good things happen." The landscape around him looked like someone had asked a particularly depressed architect to design Hell's Industrial District. Massive spires of black stone reached toward a sky the color of old blood, while Gothic structures that screamed, "We take our grimdark very seriously here," dotted the horizon. Somewhere in the distance, explosions painted the sky in shades of violence, and Peter's enhanced hearing picked up the distinctive sound of very large guns being fired with extreme prejudice. That's when his spider sense exploded into full alarm mode, and Peter threw himself sideways just as something the size of a small building crashed into the spot where he'd been standing. The something in question had too many teeth, too many claws, and too many eyes, all of which seemed personally offended by Peter's continued existence. "Let me guess," Peter said, web-slinging away from what looked like someone had crossed a praying mantis with a motorcycle and given the result serious anger management issues. "You're the local welcoming committee?" The creature responded by trying to remove his head with claws that could probably slice through tank armor. Peter's spider sense guided him through a series of increasingly acrobatic dodges while his brain tried to process what he was seeing. More of the creatures were pouring over the horizon like a living tide of nightmare fuel, and advancing to meet them was a line of human soldiers that looked like they'd stepped out of every dystopian future movie ever made. They wore uniforms of military green and carried weapons that hummed with barely contained energy, and every single one of them looked like they'd seen things that would make normal people need therapy for several lifetimes. "Imperial Guard, form firing lines," The command cut through the chaos with parade ground precision, and Peter watched in fascination as the soldiers moved with the fluid efficiency of a military unit that had drilled these maneuvers until they could perform them in their sleep. "For the Emperor!" The response came as a thunderous roar from 10,000 throats. "For the Emperor!" Then the lasguns opened fire, and Peter got his first taste of 41st Millennium warfare.
The synchronized volley of lasgun fire turned the battlefield into a light show that would have made Times Square jealous if Times Square had been designed by people with a serious grudge against everything alive. Crimson beams lanced through the air with surgical precision, and wherever they struck the chitinous hides of the advancing creatures, flesh sizzled and popped like overcooked bacon. Peter had to admit, these soldiers knew their business, but the sheer number of alien nasties pouring over the ridge suggested that knowing your business and surviving your business were two very different things. His spider sense was having what could generously be called a complete nervous breakdown. Every instinct Peter had developed over years of web-slinging through New York's criminal underworld was screaming that approximately everything in his immediate vicinity wanted to kill him in ways that would be creative, painful, and probably involve way too many teeth. "Okay, Parker," he muttered, web-slinging between the Gothic spires while lasbolts zipped past his head like angry fireflies. "Let's see what we're working with here." One of the creatures, Peter decided to call them Bitey McStabface for his own sanity, had broken through the Imperial line and was currently in the process of turning a squad of guardsmen into what the culinary world might generously term mystery meat. The soldiers were laying down suppression fire with admirable discipline, but their sergeant was about to become an impromptu chew toy, and Peter's hero instincts kicked in before his common sense could file a formal complaint. "Hey, ugly!" Peter called out, web-slinging down into the fray. "Yeah, you, with the excessive dental work. Pick on someone your own size." The Tyrannid Hormagagaunt, though Peter had no way of knowing that's what the Imperium called these particular agents of galactic extinction, turned toward him with the kind of predatory focus usually reserved for nature documentaries about apex predators. Its scything talons carved through the air where Peter had been a split second before, but spider sense was apparently just as effective in the 41st millennium as it had been back home. "Whoa there, chompers," Peter quipped, firing twin streams of webbing that caught the creature's primary talons and yanked them wide. "I know I'm irresistibly delicious, but let's try to keep this relationship professional." The Hormagagaunt shrieked, a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard mixed with a garbage disposal having an existential crisis, and lunged forward with its secondary arms. Peter's enhanced reflexes kicked in, and he found himself moving in ways that seemed to violate several local ordinances against defying physics. He twisted through the air in a spiral pattern that took him around the creature's flank, then delivered a punch that would have dented a car door back home. The Hormagagaunt flew backward about 15 feet and crashed into a ruined wall with enough force to crack the ancient stonework. The silence that followed was the kind of profound quiet that usually preceded either enlightenment or very serious trouble. "Holy Terra," whispered the sergeant Peter had just saved, his lasgun still smoking in his hands. "What in the Emperor's name are you?" "Well," Peter said, straightening up and trying to look casual while covered in alien gore, "that's actually a really good question. I was kind of hoping you might know." That's when the rest of the guardsmen noticed that the weird figure in the red and blue botsuit had just punched a Tyrannid bioform hard enough to put it through a wall, without power armor, without any visible augmetics, and while making jokes. "Contact rear command," the sergeant said in the kind of carefully controlled voice people used when they were trying very hard not to think about what they'd just witnessed. "Tell them we have a situation." Peter's spider sense chose that moment to inform him that roughly 24 more Hormagaunts were approaching from 3 different directions, along with something much larger that his enhanced hearing suggested had way too many legs and a serious attitude problem. "You know," Peter said conversationally, firing web lines to anchor himself between 2 Gothic buttresses, "I'm starting to get the feeling that this isn't going to be the kind of day where everything works out with minimal property damage and everybody goes home for dinner." The carnifex that crested the ridge beyond the Hormagaunts was roughly the size of a small building and looked like someone had asked a fever dream to design the ultimate biological killing machine. Its bone-white carapace bore scars from what had obviously been hundreds of previous battles, and its 4 scything talons swept the ground in front of it with the casual efficiency of industrial farming equipment. "By the Golden Throne," breathed the sergeant. "Carnifex, call in airmo support, call in everything." Peter watched the massive bioform advance with the inexorable patience of a glacier made of hate, and felt his spider sense settle into what he'd learned to recognize as the "you're about to do something incredibly stupid but necessary" frequency. "You know," he said brightly, firing web lines to anchor himself between 2 Gothic buttresses, "we could try something a little more direct." The watching Space Marines, concealed in the ruins of an ancient chapel half a mile away, adjusted their magnification settings and prepared to witness either the most spectacular act of heroism they'd seen in decades or the most entertaining suicide in recent memory. Brother Sergeant Thaddeus of the Crimson Fists lowered his scope and shook his head. "Mark this grid reference," he said quietly. "Command needs to see this."
The Crimson Fist's strike cruiser, Defiant Valor, had seen better centuries. Its cathedral-like command bridge bore the scars of 1,000 battles, from orc boarding actions to daemon incursions, and the massive view screen currently displayed tactical data that would have given most Imperial commanders nightmares. Chapter Master Cantor stood before the hololithic display, his ancient power armor humming quietly as servo skulls drifted overhead like mechanical cherubim, updating battlefield reports in real time. "Explain this to me again, Brother Sergeant," Cantor said, his voice carrying the weight of 4 centuries of warfare. The recording from Thaddeus's Auspex played for the 3rd time, showing the red and blue figure systematically dismantling Tyranid bioforms with what could only be described as acrobatic enthusiasm. "The subject appears to be unaugmented human stock," Thaddeus reported, standing at attention. "No visible power armor, no cybernetic enhancements that our sensors can detect. Yet he demonstrates reflexes that exceed even our own enhanced capabilities. And, Master," he paused, "he was making jokes during combat with Tyranids." Master of the Forge Lysander looked up from his data slate, his bionic eye whirring as it focused. The xenoforms showed clear behavioral confusion. Several Hormagaunts actually stopped mid-charge when the subject began what appears to be verbal mockery. He called a Carnifex big guy and asked if it was compensating for something, added Brother Techmarine Korath, his mechanical fingers clicking across holographic interfaces. The bioform's response patterns were completely outside established parameters. It hesitated for 3.7 seconds before engaging. Chapter Master Cantor had seen many impossible things in his long service to the Emperor. He'd fought daemons that shouldn't exist, faced orc wars that defied logic, and survived the siege of Rin's world when all tactical doctrine said they should have died. But this recording presented a puzzle that threatened to give him what mortals call a headache. "Show me the genetic analysis," he commanded. The hololith shifted to display a complex double helix that looked like someone had taken normal human DNA and asked it to get creative.
Red markers highlighted sections that pulsed with an energy signature that didn't match anything in the Imperial's extensive xenobiology databases. Unknown radiation exposure, reported Chief Apothecary Garradon. The subject's genetic structure has been fundamentally altered, but in ways that enhance rather than corrupt. Enhanced reflexes, increased physical strength, and what appears to be some form of precognitive ability. But Master, he paused, consulting his data slate. There's no sign of chaos taint, no warp corruption. If anything, his genetic pattern suggests extraordinary resistance to psychic influence. Cantor's scarred features remained impassive, but internally he was processing implications that could reshape the chapter's understanding of human evolution. The Great Crusade had documented thousands of human variants across the galaxy, but nothing quite like this. And the timing, appearing during a Tyranid incursion, demonstrating abilities that seemed almost tailor-made for combating the Hive fleets, suggested either the most fortuitous coincidence in Imperial history or something much more significant. Chaplain Dreadnought Riston's assessment, Cantor asked. The ancient warrior's sarcophagus spoke with the authority of 800 years of service. His mind shows no signs of corruption, Chapter Master. Unusual thought patterns, certainly. A tendency toward what mortals call humor, even in combat situations. But his devotion to protecting innocence appears genuine. Most concerning is his complete ignorance of the Imperium, the Emperor, or any aspect of our reality. He claims to originate from something called New York on Earth, yet Terra shows no record of such designations. Temporal displacement, suggested Techmarine Koraf. Possible, Cantor mused. Or dimensional breach. The Tyranids themselves seem drawn to this world for reasons beyond standard biomass collection. Perhaps this Peter Parker, he tested the alien name carefully, is connected to their presence. Master of Sanctity Grimaldus entered the command center, his skull helmet gleaming in the bridge's harsh lighting. Chapter Master, I've completed my interrogation of the subject. Interrogation is a strong word, Cantor observed. From what I understand, he wouldn't stop talking. Correct. He provided detailed accounts of his origins, abilities, and motivation without any prompting. He also asked if we had pizza and whether our armor came in fun colors. Grimaldus's tone suggested he was still processing this particular trauma. Most disturbing was his complete lack of proper fear or reverence when discussing the Emperor. He referred to the Master of Mankind as Big E and asked if he was like Professor X but with more golden bling. A profound silence fell on the command bridge. Several servo skulls actually stopped mid-flight as if the machine spirits themselves were processing this information. However, Grimaldus continued, his genetic structure and demonstrated abilities suggest he could potentially survive the transformation process. His altered physiology might actually make him more compatible with our gene seed than normal human recruits. Cantor considered this. The Crimson Fists had lost nearly their entire chapter during the Orc invasion of Rin's world. They'd been rebuilding for decades, accepting recruits from a wider age and background than most chapters would consider. But this was different. This was attempting something that hadn't been tried in 10,000 years, transforming an adult human with unknown genetic modifications into an Astartes. The risk assessment, he asked. Significant, admitted Apothecary Garradon. The gene seed rejection rate for adult subjects approaches 97%. Adding unknown genetic variables increases the danger exponentially. If the process fails, it will likely kill him. If it succeeds, we may have created something unprecedented. Cantor looked out at the tactical display where red markers showed Tyranid bioships moving in ominous patterns through the outer system. The galaxy was burning, the Imperium was dying by degrees, and the enemies of mankind grew stronger with each passing year. Sometimes, desperate times called for desperate measures. "Prep the apothecarium," he commanded. "Begin preliminary trials immediately. And if he objects, Chapter Master." Cantor's smile held no warmth whatsoever. "Brother Chaplain, have you ever tried to argue with someone who makes jokes during a firefight with Tyranids?" "No, Chapter Master." "Neither have I. This should be educational."
The Reclusium of the Crimson Fists had been designed with a specific purpose in mind: to break down the human mind and rebuild it in the Emperor's image. Its walls bore 10,000 years of accumulated gravitas, carved with litanies of hate, purity seals, and enough Gothic imagery to make a cathedral jealous. The hypno-indoctrination chamber sat at its heart like a mechanical altar, all brass fittings and neural interface cables, humming with the kind of low-frequency dread that usually accompanied visits to the dentist, if the dentist was a fanatical warrior monk, and the cleaning involved having your entire worldview surgically removed. Chaplain Grimaldus stood before the ancient machinery with the reverence due to a sacred relic, checking each cable and connection with ritualistic precision. Brother Apothecary Garadon monitored bio-readings on screens that flickered with data streams measuring everything from neural activity to genetic compatibility. The air itself seemed thick with incense and the weight of impending transformation. And in the center of it all, strapped to the indoctrination throne like he was waiting for a particularly elaborate medical procedure, Peter Parker was absolutely ruining the entire atmosphere. "So let me get this straight," Peter said, craning his neck to look at the Baroque machinery surrounding him. "You're gonna stick electrodes in my brain and basically download the Space Marine equivalent of basic training directly into my head?" "The sacred hypno-indoctrination process will impart the fundamental doctrines of our chapter," Grimaldus intoned solemnly, activating neural interface probes that descended from the ceiling like metallic spiders. "You will learn the Codex Astartes, the Imperial Creed, proper veneration of the God Emperor, and—" Wait, hold up," Peter interrupted, causing Grimaldus to pause mid-ritual. "Did you just say God Emperor? Because I gotta tell you, back where I come from, people who call themselves God Emperor usually turn out to be the bad guys. Are we sure we're on the right side here?" The silence that followed was so profound that somewhere in the distance, a servo skull actually fell out of the air. "The Emperor," Grimaldus said in the tone usually reserved for explaining fundamental concepts to particularly slow children, "is the master of mankind, the light in the darkness, the guardian of human—" "Right, but does he pay taxes? Because immortal god kings have a pretty sketchy track record when it comes to reasonable fiscal policy." Brother Apothecary Garadon looked at his readings and made a note that roughly translated to, "Subject appears to be allergic to proper reverence. The hypno-indoctrination will correct these theological irregularities," Grimaldus said, his skull-faced helmet managing to convey disapproval despite being an inanimate object. "Initiating neural interface now." The machinery hummed to life, and Peter felt the familiar tingle of his spider sense as electrodes made contact with his scalp. For a moment, everything proceeded according to 10,000 years of established protocol. Data streams began flowing, downloading centuries of accumulated Space Marine doctrine, battle cant, and unshakable loyalty to the Imperium directly into Peter's neural pathways.
Then Peter's genetically enhanced brain looked at the incoming information, processed it with the speed of thought, and did what Peter Parker's brain always did when confronted with authority figures. It started asking questions. Okay, so the Emperor built this Imperium to unite humanity. That's cool, very noble, but then he decided to conquer every other species in the galaxy just because they weren't human? That seems a little genocide-y. Warning runes began flashing on Garradon's medical displays. The Xenos are a threat to human purity, Grimaldus responded, adjusting settings to increase doctrinal compliance. The Emperor's wisdom, but some of these aliens seem pretty reasonable. The Tau have better healthcare than you guys, and they're not constantly setting people on fire for having unauthorized thoughts. Are we sure we're not the baddies in some of these scenarios? More warning runes. Garradon's instruments were now suggesting that instead of accepting hypno-indoctrination, Peter's brain was actually analyzing it, cross-referencing it with his own moral framework, and filing formal complaints. Increasing doctrinal input, Grimaldus muttered, his mechanical fingers dancing across control surfaces. Perhaps greater emphasis on the threat of chaos. Oh yeah, I'm reading about chaos now. So these are basically evil gods that feed on negative emotions and corrupt people through temptation and despair? Exactly. Finally, some proper understanding of... So then wouldn't the logical response be to create a society based on hope, compassion, and emotional stability? Instead of, an authoritarian nightmare state where everyone lives in constant fear and misery? Because I gotta say, from an outside perspective, it looks like you guys are basically serving chaos a 7-course meal of despair with a side order of oppression. The warning runes on Garradon's screens had given up flashing and were now displaying what could only be described as electronic expressions of existential despair. Brother Chaplain, Garradon said carefully, the subject's neural patterns are unusual. Instead of accepting indoctrination, he appears to be conducting a real-time philosophical audit of Imperial doctrine. I can hear you guys, Peter said, helpfully. And I'm not trying to be difficult here, it's just that your whole civilization seems like it was designed by someone who read 1984 and thought, hey, that looks fun. You've got thought police, mandatory worship of an autocrat, constant war, and a society where asking questions gets you executed. Back where I come from, we'd call this dystopian nightmare fuel. Grimaldus stared at his instruments as if they had personally betrayed him. 10,000 years of hypno-indoctrination technology, refined through millennia of battlefield experience, and it was being defeated by someone who couldn't stop asking, but why? Like a particularly persistent 5-year-old? He said, perhaps we should try a different approach. Oh, I've got suggestions, Peter said enthusiastically. What if instead of brainwashing me, you just explain why you do things the way you do them? I mean, I'm already on board with the protect innocent people part, which seems to be your core mission anyway. The rest of this stuff about purity and eternal war and burning heretics just seems like middle management run amok. In the observation deck above, Chapter Master Cantor watched the proceedings with what could be charitably called morbid fascination. Status report, Chaplain? Grimaldus's voice carried the weight of a man who had just discovered that everything he thought he knew about neural conditioning was apparently wrong. The subject appears to be hypno-indoctrination resistant, Chapter Master, possibly hypno-indoctrination immune. Is that bad? Sir, I honestly don't know anymore.
The Apothecarian of the Defiant Valor was a temple to biological perfection and controlled evolution, where the sacred gene seed of the Primarchs underwent the delicate alchemy that transformed mortal flesh into something approaching divinity. Servo skulls drifted between banks of monitoring equipment like mechanical seraphim, while Chief Apothecary Garradon prepared for what he was privately calling either the greatest breakthrough in Astartes biology
or the most spectacular medical disaster in chapter history. Peter lay on the surgical altar because calling it a medical table would have been like calling the Sistine Chapel a nice room, watching with fascination as robotic arms descended from the ceiling, carrying instruments that looked like they'd been designed by someone who really enjoyed their work. His spider sense was providing a steady stream of warnings about impending bodily modification. But Peter had learned to distinguish between "you're about to be hurt" and "you're about to be improved in ways that will probably hurt first." "So," Peter said conversationally as Garradon prepared the first gene seed implant, "this is going to give me a second heart, right? That seems excessive. I mean, one heart's been working fine for me so far. What's the backup for? Redundancy, or are you planning to work me so hard I need industrial-grade circulation?" Brother Apothecary Garradon paused in his preparations. In 3 centuries of performing gene seed implantation, he'd never had a subject who wanted to discuss the cardiovascular benefits of dual heart modification while strapped to the operating table. The secondary heart provides enhanced blood flow during combat stress. It also allows for continued function if the primary heart is damaged. Makes sense, Peter nodded approvingly. Very practical. Although I have to ask, and this might be a weird question, but what happens if someone tries to stake me through the heart? Do they have to hit both hearts, or just the primary one? Stake you? Garradon's bionic eye whirred in confusion. What manner of weapon is a stake? Oh, right, different universe, never mind. It's probably not going to come up. What Peter didn't mention was that his spider sense was providing increasingly specific warnings about the gene seed itself. The progenoid organs that Garradon was preparing to implant carried genetic information from Primarch Rogel Dorn, filtered through 10,000 years of careful cultivation and enhancement. But as the implants came closer to Peter's genetically altered physiology, his enhanced senses were picking up something that could only be described as biological recognition. The radioactive spider that had bitten him in that laboratory so many years ago had done more than grant him proportional spider strength and the ability to stick to walls. It had fundamentally rewritten his genetic code, creating new patterns and possibilities that existed nowhere else in nature. And now, as the gene seed approached his modified DNA, both sets of genetic instructions seemed to be having what could only be called a conversation. Interesting, Garradon murmured, watching his instruments with growing fascination. Your cellular structure appears to be adapting to the gene seed before implantation. I've never seen compatibility markers this strong. Is that good or bad? Peter asked, noting that several of the monitoring screens were displaying what looked like genetic fireworks. Unknown, Garradon admitted. Beginning implantation sequence. The first insertion went smoothly. The secondary heart settled into Peter's chest cavity like it had been waiting for an invitation. But as Garradon began the second phase, introducing the osmedulla that would enhance Peter's skeletal structure, something unprecedented occurred. Peter's spider DNA didn't just accept the gene seed modifications, it improved them with a kind of biological engineering that should have taken millennia to evolve. By the throne, Garradon whispered, watching readouts that showed bone density increases far exceeding normal Astartes parameters. The enhancement rate it's impossible. His skeletal structure is becoming denser than ceramite while maintaining complete flexibility. On the monitoring screens, genetic patterns danced and merged like living mandalas. Peter's radioactive spider genes were taking the Astartes modifications and optimizing them with the kind of biological engineering that should have taken millennia to evolve. Enhanced muscle mass, improved reflexes, heightened senses, all the standard Astartes upgrades were being refined and perfected by genetic instructions that seemed to understand the concept of superhero on a fundamental level. How do you feel? Garradon asked, monitoring neural activity as the third implant took hold. Tingly, Peter replied cheerfully. Also kind of itchy, and Oh wow, I can suddenly hear conversations 3 decks away. Is that normal? For an Astartes, yes. For someone whose auditory enhancement is measuring at twice standard parameters, no. The process continued with each implant exceeding expected integration rates. The multi-lung began functioning immediately, providing Peter with atmospheric processing capabilities that would let him survive in environments that would kill normal humans. The Hymastamen started producing blood cells that carried oxygen more efficiently than anything in Imperial medical databases, and the Laraman's organ began synthesizing healing factors that made normal Astartes recovery rates look sluggish. Status report. Chapter Master Cantor's voice came through the comm system. Chapter Master Garadon's voice carried a mixture of awe and clinical fascination. The subject is not rejecting the gene seed. He's perfecting it. Explain. Each implant is integrating at efficiency rates that exceed anything in our records. His existing genetic modifications appear to be enhancing the Astartes biology rather than competing with it. If these readings are accurate, he's going to be stronger, faster, and tougher than any space marine we've ever produced. In the surgical chamber, Peter felt the changes cascading through his system like biological upgrades clicking into place. His spider strength was being amplified by Astartes muscle enhancement. His spider sense was being refined by improved neural processing. His proportional spider speed was being boosted by cardiovascular modifications that would make a racehorse jealous. One more question, Peter said, his voice already carrying new resonances as his vocal cords adapted to Astartes' specifications. After all this is done, do I still get to make jokes during fights? Because I have to tell you, the thought of being a grim, humorless killing machine is really bumming me out. Garadon paused, surgical instruments in hand. That is not typically covered in standard post-implantation protocols. Can we make it a special exception? I promise to keep the jokes tactically relevant. Tactically relevant? You know, like taunting enemies into making strategic mistakes, boosting ally morale through inappropriate levity, that sort of thing. I'm pretty good at it. Garadon looked at his readings, which suggested that Peter's brain chemistry was adapting to produce stress reduction neurochemicals at rates that would make combat fatigue essentially impossible. I will make a note in your medical file. Excellent. This is going to be fun.
The armory sanctum of the Crimson Fists was a cathedral of war, where suits of power armor hung like technological saints in alcoves carved from blessed stone. Each suit of Mark VII Aquila armor represented centuries of accumulated knowledge, from the servo bundles that provided superhuman strength to the auto-reactive shoulder plates that could deflect bolter rounds. Master of the Forge Lysander had overseen the sacred maintenance rituals for these relics for over 2 centuries, and in all that time, he'd never had a suit of power armor file a formal complaint about its wearer. Today, however, was proving to be a day of firsts. Brother Forge Master. Tech Marine Korath called from across the armory, his mechadendrites writhing in what could only be described as mechanical distress. Suit designation MK74471 is reporting unusual stress patterns. Lysander looked up from the sacred oils he was applying to a suit of Terminator armor. Define unusual. The servo motors in the knee joints are operating at 127% of rated capacity. The gyro stabilizers are compensating for movement patterns that don't match any established Astartes locomotion profiles. And the machine spirit keeps sending error messages that translate roughly to, "What in the Omnisea's name is the wearer doing?" Inside the Mark VII armor, Peter Parker was discovering that superhuman agility and 10,000-year-old power armor were not necessarily compatible design philosophies. The suit had been built for space marines who moved with the deliberate, economical precision of professional warriors. Peter moved like someone who had learned to navigate three-dimensional space by pretending gravity was more of a suggestion than a law. Okay, so wall crawling is definitely not covered in the user manual, Peter muttered, hanging upside down from the armory ceiling while the suit's gyroscope spun frantically trying to figure out which way was up. Note to self, stick to floors for the first week or so. He dropped from the ceiling in a controlled flip that would have looked perfectly natural if performed by someone wearing a flexible costume. Performed in a suit of ceramite power armor that weighed as much as a small vehicle, created stress readings that made the machine spirit wonder if it was having a nervous breakdown. Subject Parker. Lysander's voice came through the Vox system with the patience of someone dealing with a particularly creative technical challenge. Please remain on horizontal surfaces until we can calibrate the armor's motion parameters. Sure thing, Peter replied, immediately web-slinging to a vertical wall and sticking there with his arms crossed. Is this better? The sound that came through the armory speakers was the mechanical equivalent of a sigh. The fiber bundle muscles in the gauntlets are registering adhesion forces that exceed theoretical maximums. How is he generating van der Waals forces through ceramic plating? Peter, meanwhile, was discovering that his spider powers worked through power armor in ways that defied every law of physics he thought he understood. The suit's tactile feedback systems were somehow transmitting his ability to stick to surfaces through layers of blessed ceramic and adamantine weave, as if his genetic modifications had decided that a little thing like being encased in tank armor wasn't going to stop them from wall crawling. Hey, Peter called out, still casually attached to the wall 20 feet above the floor. Is it normal for the armor to feel tingly? Define tingly, Lysander replied, though he suspected he didn't want to know the answer. Like it's trying to figure out how I'm doing this and getting frustrated because it doesn't compute. Techmarine Korath consulted his data slate with the expression of someone whose worldview was being systematically dismantled by empirical evidence. The machine spirit is confused. It's designed to interface with Astartes' nervous systems, but your neural patterns are generating feedback it can't categorize. It keeps trying to run diagnostic routines on abilities that shouldn't exist. Oh, that explains the weird buzzing sensation, Peter said, casually walking down the wall to floor level. Maybe if I explain to it what I'm doing. You want to talk to the machine spirit? Why not? It's clearly trying to communicate. Back home, I always got along great with technology once I explained things properly. Before anyone could point out the numerous theological problems with having a casual conversation with the sacred machine spirit of power armor, Peter had placed his gauntleted hands against the nearest cogitator interface and begun what could only be described as interspecies diplomacy. Hey there, little guy. I know I'm confusing you, but here's the thing. I'm not exactly standard human baseline. I got bitten by a radioactive spider which rewrote my DNA to include some really useful arachnid abilities. The wall sticking thing works through molecular adhesion forces that my body generates naturally. The enhanced agility comes from modified muscle fibers and a nervous system that processes spatial information about 3 times faster than normal human parameters. The armory fell silent as Peter continued his impromptu technical briefing to a suit of power armor that was, theoretically, an inanimate object. The precognitive danger sense is probably the weirdest part. It's some kind of limited psychic ability that manifests as early warning of incoming threats. I know that sounds impossible, but I've been using it for years and it's saved my life more times than I can count. So when you feel those weird neural spikes, that's just my spider sense doing its thing. What happened next would require 3 formal reports, 2 theological inquiries, and a consultation with the chapter's most senior tech marines. The machine spirit of Peter's armor began generating response patterns that suggested not just comprehension, but what could only be described as enthusiastic cooperation. Warning icons disappeared from monitoring screens. System efficiency ratings jumped to levels that made veteran tech marines double-check their instruments. The armor's movement parameters began adapting in real time, learning to anticipate and support Peter's unconventional locomotion patterns rather than fighting them. "By the Omniscius," Korath whispered, watching data streams that showed the armor actively optimizing itself for spider-like movement. The machine spirit isn't just accepting his abilities, it's learning from them. Peter flexed his fingers and the armor's tactile systems responded by amplifying his natural adhesion abilities. He shifted his weight and the gyro stabilizers adjusted to support three-dimensional navigation. He triggered his spider sense and the armor's threat detection systems began integrating precognitive data into their targeting protocols. This is either a miracle or the most magnificent act of technological heresy I've ever witnessed. "Can it be both?" Peter asked, cheerfully, demonstrating his point by casually jogging up the wall and across the ceiling while his armor purred like a satisfied mechanical cat. Somewhere in the depths of the ship, Chapter Master Cantor made a note to have a very long conversation with the chaplains about expanding their definition of acceptable miracle categories.
The 10th Company Scout Training Grounds aboard the Defiant Valor had been designed to break young aspirants and rebuild them as Space Marines. Obstacle courses that would challenge Olympic athletes, live fire exercises with actual bolter rounds, and combat scenarios that assumed a certain baseline level of suicidal bravery. All overseen by Scout Sergeant Huron Grimm, a man whose idea of gentle encouragement involved explosives and whose motivational speeches typically ended with casualty reports. What Sergeant Grimm had not prepared for was a scout who treated the entire experience like the world's most elaborate jungle gym. "Parker!" Grimm's voice could strip paint at 50 meters. "Get down from there! The infiltration course is supposed to be completed on the ground!" 20 meters above the training deck, Peter was casually web-swinging between support girders, while his fellow scouts struggled through razor wire and pit traps below. His modified Mark 7 armor had adapted to his movement style so well that it was now providing helpful targeting data for optimal web anchor points, complete with structural stress analysis for each potential swing trajectory. "But Sergeant," Peter called down, executing a perfect somersault that took him over 3 different obstacle configurations. "The mission parameters didn't specify ground-based movement. You said, reach the objective without being detected. I'm reaching the objective, and I'm definitely not being detected up here." Scout Brother Maximus, currently face down in mud while trying to crawl under concertina wire, looked up with the expression of someone whose entire understanding of military protocol was being challenged. How is he doing that? We've been training for 2 years just to move quietly, and he's treating this like a recreational activity. "Focus on your own performance, Scout Maximus," Grimm barked, though privately, he was wondering the same thing. Peter had been assigned to scout training as part of his integration into the chapter, despite having already undergone full Astartes modification. The logic had been that he needed to learn Codex-approved tactics and battlefield discipline. The reality was that Peter approached every tactical scenario like a physics problem that could be solved with sufficient creativity and complete disregard for conventional thinking. The current exercise was a simulated infiltration of an orc position, complete with motion detectors, automated gun servitors, and enough booby traps to level a small building. The standard Codex approach called for careful reconnaissance, coordinated movement, and systematic elimination of threats through stealth and precision. Peter's approach could best be described as interpretive warfare. "Contact front," Scout Brother Thaddeus called out as a gun servitor swiveled toward his position, taking cover. "I got it!" Peter's voice came from directly above the servitor, which was having what could only be described as a mechanical existential crisis as it tried to track a target that was apparently defying gravity. Peter dropped onto the automated weapon system like a friendly neighborhood spider, and before anyone could explain the proper codex procedure for servitor disarmament, he'd webbed up its targeting sensors and given it what he cheerfully called the percussive maintenance treatment. The servitor made sad beeping noises and shut down. "That's not how you're supposed to disable enemy equipment," Scout Brother Cassius said weakly, still crouched behind cover and processing what he just witnessed. "Did it work?" Peter asked, hanging upside down from the deactivated servitor. "Then it's tactically sound. Don't overthink it, guys. Sometimes the best plan is the one the enemy never sees coming." Sergeant Grimm was beginning to understand why the chaplains had been muttering about doctrinal flexibility and adaptive interpretation of established protocols. Every exercise designed to teach proper Space Marine combat techniques was being turned into an impromptu demonstration of what happened when you gave superhuman abilities to someone who learned warfare from comic books instead of the Codex Astartes. The next phase of the exercise called for coordinated fire team tactics against multiple targets. The scouts were supposed to advance by bounds, providing covering fire for each other while maintaining proper spacing and communication discipline. Peter's fire team did maintain proper spacing. It's just that his idea of proper spacing included the vertical dimension in ways that the Codex had never considered. "Parker, you're supposed to advance with your squad!" Grimm shouted as Peter web-slung over the heads of his astonished battle brothers. "I am advancing with my squad," Peter called back, firing his bolt pistol at targets while swinging through the air like a one-man aerial circus. "I'm just advancing three-dimensionally." What made it even maddening was that Peter's unorthodox tactics were actually working. His spider sense let him detect ambushes before they were sprung. His enhanced agility allowed him to flank enemies from angles they couldn't defend against. And his habit of making jokes during combat was having a profoundly demoralizing effect on the training servitors, which had been programmed to respond to standard Space Marine aggression patterns, but had no protocols for dealing with someone who called them Metal Buddy and asked if they needed a hug while systematically dismantling their weapon systems. The servitor made sad beeping noises and shut down. "That's not how you're supposed to disable enemy equipment," Scout Brother Cassius said weakly, still crouched behind cover and processing what he just witnessed. "Did it work?" Peter asked, hanging upside down from the deactivated servitor. "Then it's tactically sound. Don't overthink it, guys. Sometimes the best plan is the one the enemy never sees coming." Sergeant Grimm was beginning to understand why the chaplains had been muttering about doctrinal flexibility and adaptive interpretation of established protocols. Every exercise designed to teach proper Space Marine combat techniques was being turned into an impromptu demonstration of what happened when you gave superhuman abilities to someone who learned warfare from comic books instead of the Codex Astartes. The next phase of the exercise called for coordinated fire team tactics against multiple targets. The scouts were supposed to advance by bounds, providing covering fire for each other while maintaining proper spacing and communication discipline. Peter's fire team did maintain proper spacing. It's just that his idea of proper spacing included the vertical dimension in ways that the Codex had never considered. "Parker, you're supposed to advance with your squad!" Grimm shouted as Peter web-slung over the heads of his astonished battle brothers. "I am advancing with my squad," Peter called back, firing his bolt pistol at targets while swinging through the air like a one-man aerial circus. "I'm just advancing three-dimensionally." What made it even maddening was that Peter's unorthodox tactics were actually working. His spider sense let him detect ambushes before they were sprung. His enhanced agility allowed him to flank enemies from angles they couldn't defend against. and his habit of making jokes during combat was having a profoundly demoralizing effect on the training servitors, which had been programmed to respond to standard Space Marine aggression patterns, but had no protocols for dealing with someone who called them Metal Buddy and asked if they needed a hug while systematically dismantling their weapon systems. The servitor made sad beeping noises and shut down. "That's not how you're supposed to disable enemy equipment," Scout Brother Cassius said weakly, still crouched behind cover and processing what he just witnessed. "Did it work?" Peter asked, hanging upside down from the deactivated servitor. "Then it's tactically sound. Don't overthink it, guys. Sometimes the best plan is the one the enemy never sees coming." Sergeant Grimm was beginning to understand why the chaplains had been muttering about doctrinal flexibility and adaptive interpretation of established protocols. Every exercise designed to teach proper Space Marine combat techniques was being turned into an impromptu demonstration of what happened when you gave superhuman abilities to someone who learned warfare from comic books instead of the Codex Astartes. The next phase of the exercise called for coordinated fireteam tactics against multiple targets. The scouts were supposed to advance by bounds, providing covering fire for each other while maintaining proper spacing and communication discipline. Peter's fire team did maintain proper spacing. It's just that his idea of proper spacing included the vertical dimension in ways that the Codex had never considered. "Parker, you're supposed to advance with your squad!" Grimm shouted as Peter web-slung over the heads of his astonished battle brothers. "I am advancing with my squad," Peter called back, firing his bolt pistol at targets while swinging through the air like a one-man aerial circus. "I'm just advancing three-dimensionally." What made it even maddening was that Peter's unorthodox tactics were actually working. His spider sense let him detect ambushes before they were sprung. His enhanced agility allowed him to flank enemies from angles they couldn't defend against. And his habit of making jokes during combat was...
The world of Groxholm had been having a perfectly miserable day even before the orcs showed up. Its primary industries were mud farming and complaining about the weather. Its population consisted mostly of people who had gotten lost on their way to better planets, and its strategic value could best be described as negligible, bordering on non-existent. But Groxholm did have two things going for it: a small Imperial Guard garrison commanded by Colonel Vex, and the dubious honor of being Spider Marine Peter Parker's first official combat deployment. The Orc Wa that had descended on the planet was, by galactic standards, relatively modest. Maybe 40,000 greenskins with delusions of grandeur and enough scrap metal to build a small moon. By local standards, it represented the kind of existential threat that made people seriously reconsider their life choices. "Orcs inbound from multiple vectors," reported Captain Taurus over the Vox, his voice carrying the carefully controlled tension of someone trying to sound professional while watching a green tide of violence approach his position. Estimated strength, all of them. High above the battlefield, Peter clung to the underside of a Thunderhawk gunship, watching through his armor's enhanced optics as the orc hordes spread across the muddy plains like a particularly enthusiastic natural disaster. His spider sense was providing a constant stream of tactical data, cataloging threats and opportunities with the precision of a military computer that had learned to appreciate irony. "This is Scout Parker to command," he voxed, his voice carrying across the tactical channel. "Permission to engage targets of opportunity?" "Negative, Scout Parker," came the reply from Captain Thaddeus. "Maintain formation and follow established protocols for..." Peter was already gone, web-slinging toward the orc lines with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for Christmas morning. His modified armor sang through the air, servo motors purring as they adapted to flight patterns that would have made a bird envious and a physics professor weep.
The first orc he encountered was a particularly large knob who was in the process of demonstrating proper leadership technique by hitting smaller orcs with a power claw the size of a refrigerator. The knob looked up just in time to see a red and blue figure descend from the sky, like the universe's most colorful avenging angel. "Knock, knock," Peter called out cheerfully, delivering a punch that sent the knob flying backward into a mob of boys. Guess who? What followed could best be described as interpretive combat choreography. Peter moved through the orc ranks like a hyperactive tornado, web-slinging between enemies, sticking to surfaces that had no business being stuck to, and delivering quips with the same precision he used for bolt pistol headshots. Hey, green and ugly, has anyone ever told you that camouflage is supposed to help you blend in? Because you're about as subtle as a neon sign that says, "Please shoot me." The shooter boy, whose understanding of tactical banter extended roughly to "wah" and "daka daka daka," responded by emptying his clip in Peter's general direction. Peter, however, was no longer in his general direction, having web swung around behind the orc's position and delivered what the Codex Astartes would probably classify as an unconventional flanking maneuver. "And that's what we call thinking outside of the box," Peter said conversationally as the shooter boy collapsed into a pile of confused green limbs. Though, to be fair, you guys don't seem like the type to think inside the box either. Or think at all, really. What was making the situation even more surreal was that Peter's running commentary was being broadcast across the tactical channel, providing real-time battle analysis mixed with what could only be described as stand-up comedy. "Contact Sector 7, he reported while web-slinging away from a death thread that was trying to turn him into paste. Big metal thing with way too many guns and a serious anger management problem. Engaging with tactical mockery." Tactical mockery? Captain Thaddeus's voice carried the bewilderment of someone whose military training had not covered this particular combat doctrine. "It's a legitimate psychological warfare technique," Peter replied, somersaulting over the death thread's head and webbing its optical sensors. "You confuse the enemy by being so ridiculous that they stop fighting effectively and start wondering what's wrong with you." To demonstrate his point, Peter began singing while systematically dismantling the death thread's weapon systems. It was a cheerful little tune about friendship and cooperation, delivered in the kind of upbeat voice usually reserved for children's television programs. And it was having a profoundly unsettling effect on every orc within earshot. "What's wrong with that hummy?" one orc asked another, lowering his choppa in confusion. "Dunno. He's weird." This was possibly the first time in galactic history that orcs had described something else as weird. He made a mental note to include this observation in his after-action report, assuming anyone would believe it. The battle continued with Peter carving a path of cheerful destruction through the orc ranks, supported by increasingly bewildered but effective fire from his scout squad. His unconventional tactics were working better than anyone had expected. The orcs kept stopping to stare at the strange hummy who bounced around like a rubber ball and wouldn't shut up, which made them perfect targets for his battle brother's bolt rounds. "Status report, Scout Parker," came Captain Thaddeus's voice. "Oh, you know, just spreading joy and brotherhood through superior firepower and interpretive acrobatics. The usual Tuesday activities." "It's Thursday." "Is it? Time flies when you're having fun." In the command bunker 3 kilometers away, Colonel Vex was watching tactical displays that suggested reality had taken a brief vacation and left someone else in charge. "Are our casualty reports accurate?" he asked his aide. "Yes, sir. 0 Imperial casualties, approximately 400 Orc casualties, and one very confused war boss who keeps asking his knobs what a spider marine is and whether they're supposed to fight it or try to catch it." Colonel Vex made a note to request hazard pay for psychological trauma and possibly to recommend Spider Marine Parker for commendation, psychiatric evaluation, or both. On the battlefield, Peter was just getting started.
The Chaos Sorcerer Malak Thrax, the Soul Render, had spent 3 centuries perfecting his mastery of mental domination. His psychic abilities could crack the strongest will, turn allies against each other, and reduce even Space Marines to gibbering madness with nothing more than a focused thought. He had broken Imperial governors, corrupted entire planetary defense forces, and once made an entire hive city forget how to breathe for 17 minutes just to see what would happen. What he had never encountered was a mind that responded to psychic assault by cracking jokes. "Behold, loyalist dogs!" Malak Thrax shrieked from atop his floating disc of screaming faces, his voice carrying the kind of dramatic authority that usually preceded either world-ending catastrophe or really impressive special effects. "I am Malak Thrax, the Soul Render. Your minds are mine to command. Your will is forfeit to the Dark Gods." The Crimson Fist's tactical squad took cover behind the ruins of what had once been a reasonably pleasant municipal building, bolt rifles ready as they prepared to face a threat that could kill them without ever touching their bodies. This was the kind of enemy that required careful coordination, overwhelming firepower, and preferably air support from someone with really big guns. Peter Parker, however, was having other thoughts. "Soul Render?" he called out, web-slinging to a position that gave him a clear view of the floating Chaos Sorcerer. "That's your chosen professional title? Because I have to tell you, it sounds like you're either a really aggressive therapist or someone who runs a very specialized butcher shop." Malak Thrax paused mid-incantation, his demon-possessed staff crackling with warp energy. In 3 centuries of spreading corruption and despair, he'd never had anyone question his naming conventions. "Silence, fool!" he roared, directing a lance of pure psychic hatred at Peter's mind. The attack was designed to fill the target with overwhelming despair, cosmic horror, and the absolute certainty that existence was meaningless and all hope was lost. Peter's spider sense detected the incoming psychic assault, cataloged it as a threat, and then his genetically modified brain did something that Malak Thrax had never experienced. It started analyzing the attack like a particularly complicated math problem. "Oh wow," Peter said, hanging casually from a gargoyle while psychic energy crackled around him. "That's actually kind of impressive. Is that fear-based psychological manipulation with a side order of existential dread? Because I have to tell you, I grew up in New York City. I've been dealing with existential dread since I was 12. It's like psychological background noise to me." The Chaos Sorcerer's confidence flickered. His mind-crushing assault, perfected through centuries of practice, was being peer-reviewed? "Your technique is solid," Peter continued conversationally, "but you're working from some flawed assumptions. Like the whole existence is meaningless thing? That's actually kind of liberating when you think about it. If nothing matters cosmically, then the only meaning that counts is what we choose to create for ourselves. And I choose to create meaning by stopping bad guys from hurting innocent people, which makes you tonight's entertainment." "Impossible," Malak Thrax snarled, pouring more power into his psychic assault. "My mind, mortal mind, can resist the corruption of chaos. I will show you despair beyond imagining." "Been there, done that," Peter replied cheerfully. "You want to see despair beyond imagining? Try being a broke photographer in New York City with rent due and a boss who thinks please is a foreign language. Also, have you considered therapy? I'm not qualified to make professional recommendations, but you seem like you have some serious anger issues." What Malak Thrax could not understand was that Peter's mind had been shaped by years of facing impossible odds with nothing but wisecracks and determination. Every major crisis in his life, from Uncle Ben's death to facing cosmic-level threats, had taught him that humor wasn't just a coping mechanism. It was a weapon against despair. His jokes weren't just random commentary, they were his way of refusing to let the darkness win. And now, Faced with a chaos sorcerer whose power derived from crushing hope and spreading despair, Peter's relentless optimism was acting like psychological armor. "You know what your real problem is?" Peter asked, web-slinging closer to the increasingly frustrated sorcerer. "You're taking yourself too seriously. I mean, soul render? You're floating around on a disc of screaming faces wearing what looks like a Halloween costume designed by someone with severe impulse control issues. If you're going for intimidating, you've overshot straight into trying too hard territory." The other Space Marines watched in fascination as their newest battle brother engaged in what appeared to be therapeutic counseling with a chaos sorcerer while dodging bolts of psychic lightning. "Brother Parker," Captain Thaddeus voxed, "what is your tactical assessment?" "Oh, he's definitely evil, but he's also got some serious self-esteem issues hiding behind all that cosmic horror. I think if we just keep him talking, he might have a breakthrough." "A breakthrough?" "You know, like a moment of clarity where he realizes that all this chaos worship is just a way of avoiding dealing with his real problems. It happens more often than you'd think." Malak Thrax Myhivad was discovering that 3 centuries of studying the dark arts had not prepared him for psychological warfare conducted by someone who treated existential horror like a group therapy session. "Your mockery means nothing," he screamed, summoning demons that materialized around Peter like malevolent smoke. "My servants will tear you apart." "Oh, neat," Peter said, examining the lesser demons with genuine interest. "Are these the kind that exist because people believe in them, or the kind that exist independently and just really enjoy the attention? Because if it's the first type, I have some thoughts about positive reinforcement strategies." The demons, who had been summoned to rend flesh and devour souls, found themselves in the unprecedented situation of being asked about their ontological status by their intended victim. One of them actually paused mid-lunge to consider the question. "Brothers," Captain Thaddeus said over the Vox, "I believe Scout Parker may have just confused a demon into an existential crisis. Is that tactically advantageous?" asked Brother Sergeant Euron. "Unknown," Thaddeus replied, watching Peter conduct what appeared to be an impromptu philosophy seminar while web-slinging through a cloud of hostile demons.
The fortress-monastery of the Crimson Fists had survived 10,000 years of warfare by being, in the words of its original architect, aggressively impregnable. Its walls were thick enough to stop macro-cannon rounds, its void shields could deflect orbital bombardment, and its defensive systems had been designed by someone who believed that excessive firepower was a contradiction in terms. What those ancient builders had not anticipated was a scenario where the fortress would need to be defended from the inside by someone whose tactical manual appeared to have been written by a hyperactive acrobat. The Daemon incursion had begun typically enough. A warp storm had deposited roughly 300 lesser daemons and one very angry bloodthirster in the middle of the main courtyard, where they proceeded to announce their presence by setting everything on fire and screaming about skulls for some throne or another. Standard protocol called for organized retreat to defensive positions, coordinated fire lanes, and systematic elimination of threats through application of blessed ammunition and righteous fury. Peter Parker had other ideas. "You know what this place needs?" he announced over the Vox while web-slinging between Gothic spires with a bloodletter in hot pursuit. "More web infrastructure. All these beautiful architectural details and no convenient swinging points. It's like someone designed this place without considering the needs of the aerially inclined." "Scout Parker," Captain Thaddeus's voice crackled through the comm with the patience of someone who had learned to expect the unexpected. "Please clarify your tactical intentions." "Oh, I'm implementing Plan Web Everything," Peter replied cheerfully, firing streams of organic webbing between the fortress's towers, buttresses, and gargoyles with the enthusiasm of someone decorating for the world's most violent party. "What Mohammed won't come to the mountain, you build the mountain a really comprehensive transportation network." What Peter was creating, with characteristic efficiency and complete disregard for architectural dignity, was a 3-dimensional web of sticky strands that turned the entire fortress into a giant spider's domain. His enhanced understanding of structural engineering, learned the hard way through years of web-slinging through New York's skyscraper canyons, allowed him to create anchor points that could support his weight while moving at high speed,
while his spider sense guided him to optimal placement for maximum tactical advantage. The effect on the demon incursion was immediate and profoundly bewildering.
What sorcery is this?
Roared the Bloodthirster, a 12-foot-tall engine of destruction that looked like someone had asked a fever dream to design the ultimate predator. Its attempts to pursue Peter through the fortress were being systematically frustrated by a network of sticky strands that caught its wings, tangled its limbs, and generally treated the greater daemon like a very large, very angry fly. "It's not sorcery," Peter called down from his position on the fortress's highest spire. "It's applied biomechanics with a focus on urban mobility solutions. Also, has anyone ever told you that anger management classes might help with your whole skulls for the skull throne issue?" Below in the courtyard, the other Space Marines were adapting to Peter's unconventional battlefield modification with the flexibility that came from months of exposure to his creative problem-solving methods. Brother Sergeant Huron had discovered that web lines made excellent zip lines for rapid tactical repositioning. Scout Brother Maximus was using the sticky strands as impromptu tripwires for charging daemons, and Captain Thaddeus had figured out that web anchors could support the weight of a Space Marine in full battle gear, allowing for flanking maneuvers that the daemons simply weren't expecting.
This is either brilliant or the most magnificent act of architectural heresy in chapter history, muttered Tech Marine Korath as he watched his Auspex readings as the daemon forces became increasingly entangled in Peter's web network. "Why not both?" asked Brother Passius, using a web line to swing over a group of plague bearers who were trying to figure out why their feet were stuck to the ground. The Bloodthirster, meanwhile, was discovering that being a 12-foot-tall engine of destruction was actually something of a disadvantage when your opponent had turned the entire battlefield into a 3-dimensional obstacle course designed for someone a third your size. Every time it tried to take flight, web strands caught its wings. When it attempted to charge, sticky lines tangled its legs. And when it tried to climb, Peter was already 3 positions ahead, adding more webbing with the efficiency of someone who turned urban navigation into a science. "Face me in honorable combat, coward!"
the daemon roared, swinging his massive axe at web lines that stretched and absorbed the impact rather than breaking. "I am facing you," Peter pointed out reasonably, hanging upside down about 6 feet away from the daemon's Bloodthirster's face. "I'm just facing you from a tactically advantageous position. Also, you might want to look behind you." The greater daemon turned just in time to see Brother Sergeant Huron descending via webline with his chainsword revved and what could only be described as vindictive satisfaction written across his features. "For the Emperor!" Huron declared, delivering a blow that sent the Bloodthirster stumbling backward into another web cluster. "And for better urban planning," Peter added, web-slinging away as the daemon began the kind of profanity-laden tirade that usually required formal censure from the Inquisition. What followed was less a battle than it was a demonstration of what happened when you gave a creative genius unlimited access to organic construction materials and a fortress full of really angry daemons to practice on. Peter's web network allowed the Space Marines to attack from any angle, retreat through 3 dimensions, and coordinate assaults that treated vertical surfaces as just another form of cover. The daemons, who had been summoned to spread chaos and destruction through conventional means, found themselves trapped in what could only be described as the galaxy's most elaborate spiderweb, being systematically picked apart by Space Marines who were having what appeared to be entirely too much fun with the whole experience. "Status report?" Captain Thaddeus requested, swinging past a cluster of trapped blood letters. "Web network at 73% completion," Peter replied, adding another anchor point between the chapel spires. "Daemon containment holding steady, and I think Brother Maximus just figured out how to use web lines for orbital drop maneuvers."
"Is that safe?"
"Probably not, but it looks really cool." High above the battle, Chapter Master Cantor watched the proceedings through the command center's tactical displays and made a note to commission a formal study on the defensive applications of organic architecture. He also made a second note to increase the fortress's structural insurance coverage.
The 3-way firefight on the industrial world of Mordian 7 had all the hallmarks of a classic Imperial cluster mess. Chaos Space Marines trying to summon something unpleasant, Tau Fire Warriors attempting to establish a greater good foothold with extreme prejudice, and the Crimson Fists caught in the middle trying to prevent both factions from accomplishing their respective goals.
It was the kind of tactical situation that military academies used as examples of what happened when Murphy's Law decided to get creative. What none of the combatants had prepared for was commentary. "Ladies, gentlemen, and assorted Xenos," Peter's voice rang out across the battlefield as he web-slung between the ruins of a manufactorum, bolt pistols spitting death at targets of opportunity. "Welcome to tonight's main event, a triple-threat elimination match for control of this lovely industrial wasteland. In the red corner, we have the Chaos Space Marines, fighting out of the Eye of Terror camp with a record of 10,000 years of daddy issues." A Chaos Marine's bolter tracked Peter's movement, but Spider Sense guided him through a corkscrew spiral that took him around the traitor's flank. Their signature move is corrupting everything they touch, and their special ability is making reasonable people join death cults. Let's give him a hand, folks. Peter demonstrated by giving the Chaos Marine a hand, specifically a web line to the face followed by a punch that sent the traitor flying into a convenient wall. And in the blue corner, Peter continued, swinging toward a Tau Fire Warrior team that was setting up a defensive position, we have the Tau Empire, fighting for the greater good with advanced technology and a disturbing fondness for hover tanks. Their special ability is making everything more efficient through superior firepower, and their weakness is apparently close quarters combat. The Fire Warriors opened up with pulse rifle fire, but Peter was already moving, his enhanced reflexes turning their precisely calculated firing solutions into expensive light shows. Fun fact about the Tau, they have this thing called the greater good, which sounds really nice until you realize it's basically do what we say or we'll shoot you with plasma cannons. It's like a neighborhood watch program, but with more orbital bombardment. Shas El Mien, the Tau commander, spoke rapidly into his comm unit in a language that Peter's armor translated as roughly equivalent to, "What in the name of the ethereals is that thing doing?" And in the corner that's sort of a mix between gold and red, we have the Crimson Fist Space Marines. Their signature move is being really good at their jobs, and their special ability is taking everything way too seriously. Currently, they're trying to figure out whether their newest battle brother has had a psychotic break or if this is just his normal tactical approach. "Scout Parker," Captain Thaddeus's voice came through the Vox with the measured tone of someone who had given up trying to predict what would happen next. "Are you providing color commentary for our current engagement?" "Educational commentary," Peter corrected, web-slinging away from a plasma cannon blast that turned his previous perch into molten slag. "I figure if we're going to have a three-way fight, we might as well make it entertaining. Plus, I think I'm confusing the enemy forces, which seems tactically advantageous." He wasn't wrong. The Chaos Marines were used to facing enemies who approached combat with appropriate grimness and hatred. The Tau were accustomed to opponents that followed predictable tactical doctrines that could be countered through superior technology and coordinated fire. Neither faction had protocols for dealing with someone who treated warfare like a sporting event while simultaneously being more mobile than anything they'd ever encountered. "Current tactical assessment," Peter announced, using a web line to yank a Tau drone out of the sky. "The Chaos guys are really committed to their aesthetic, all spikes and skulls and dramatic poses, but they're telegraphing their attacks like they're performing for an audience. The Tau have better equipment and superior coordination, but they're having trouble adapting to non-standard movement patterns. And my fellow Space Marines are doing that thing where they're being professionally competent while secretly enjoying the chaos." "We are not enjoying the chaos," Brother Huron protested over the comm, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Brother Huron just flanked 3 Chaos Marines while they were distracted by my commentary," Peter observed, web-swinging past the tactical display his armor was providing. "If that's not enjoying the chaos, it's at least enjoying the tactical opportunities that chaos provides." The battle continued with Peter providing a running analysis of tactics, equipment, and what he cheerfully called the interpersonal dynamics of multi-faction conflict resolution through applied violence. His observations were surprisingly accurate. The Chaos Marines were indeed becoming increasingly frustrated by their inability to pin down a target who wouldn't stop talking,
while the Tau were running increasingly complex probability calculations, trying to predict movement patterns that seemed to operate on principles their tactical computers couldn't process. And there's Shas El Mien, trying to call in a hammerhead gunship. That's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see how it pays off. Spoiler alert, it probably won't, because I'm about to do something that's either brilliant or catastrophically stupid. What are you planning? Captain Thaddeus asked, though he suspected he didn't want to know. I'm going to web-sling between the Chaos Marines and the Tau Fire Warriors, provide them with detailed tactical advice about each other's weaknesses, and see if I can get them to focus on fighting each other instead of us. That's insane. That's Tuesday, Peter replied, already in motion. What followed was the most educational 3 minutes in the recent history of interspecies warfare, as Peter Parker conducted a real-time tactical seminar while swinging between 3 different armies, pointing out firing lanes to the Tau, suggesting better cover positions to the Chaos Marines, and generally treating the entire engagement like a particularly violent group project. Now the Tau commander is repositioning his Fire Warriors to take advantage of that ceramite cover I mentioned, while the Chaos Marines are using those flanking routes I suggested to get around the Tau defensive perimeter. And my fellow Space Marines are just sitting back and watching 2 enemy forces systematically eliminate each other while I provide tactical consulting services to both sides. This is either tactical genius or the most elaborate form of battlefield insanity I've ever witnessed. Why not both? Peter asked cheerfully.
The Hive Fleet tendril approaching Mordian 7th had been detected 3 days earlier by long-range Auspex arrays, and the biosignatures were enough to make seasoned Imperial commanders reach for their strongest Amasec. Tyranids didn't just invade worlds, they consumed them so thoroughly that even the bacteria in the soil became part of their galactic feeding program. What made this particular swarm especially concerning was the presence of a hive tyrant. A psychic coordination abilities could turn a chaotic mass of bioforms into a precision instrument of planetary extinction. Peter Parker's spider sense had been providing increasingly urgent warnings for the past 6 hours, building from its usual background tingle to what felt like someone had wired his nervous system to a car alarm. But as the first wave of tyrannid organisms crested the horizon like a living tsunami of teeth and claws, his precognitive abilities began operating on a level that bordered on the supernatural. "Contact all vectors," Captain Thaddeus reported over the tactical channel, his voice carrying the controlled tension of someone who had done the math and didn't like the results. "Tyrannid bioforms, estimated numbers significant." "Define significant," Peter replied, currently perched on a communications array while his enhanced senses cataloged threats with the efficiency of a military computer having an anxiety attack. "Several thousand hormagaunts, multiple carnifexes, and one very large signature that our cogitators are classifying as, 'Please reconsider your life choices.'" Peter Parker's spider sense was providing him with what could only be described as a real-time tactical overview of the entire battlefield. Every tyrannid organism was registering as a distinct threat signature, but more importantly, he was beginning to perceive the patterns underlying their movement, the subtle coordination that marked them as extensions of a single malevolent intelligence. "Guys, I think I'm reading the swarm's coordination network. It's like, imagine if an entire army was controlled by one really angry brain, but that brain was having to manage thousands of individual bodies simultaneously." "The hive mind," confirmed Brother Apothecary Garadon over the comm. "Tyrannid organisms are essentially biological drones. Sever the synapse connections and they become much less coordinated." "Right, but here's the interesting part," Peter continued, his spider sense mapping psychic connections like a 3-dimensional web of hostile intent.
The network has weak points, places where the signal is being relayed through specific organisms instead of broadcast directly. If we could disrupt those relay nodes..." He was interrupted by the arrival of the Hive Tyrant itself, a creature that looked like evolution had been asked to design the ultimate predator and had decided to throw in some extras just for fun. Standing nearly 15 feet tall, with 4 arms ending in scything talons and a skull crest that housed enough psychic firepower to level a city block, it was the kind of opponent that made reasonable people reconsider their career choices. Peter looked at the Hive Tyrant, felt his spider sense provide detailed analysis of its threat capabilities, and came to a conclusion that would have horrified any sane person. "I'm going to go talk to it," he announced. "Absolutely not," Captain Thaddeus replied immediately. "Hive Tyrants are psychic relay nodes," Peter finished, "already in motion. That thing isn't just a big scary monster, it's the central processing unit for this entire swarm. If I can disrupt its connection to the hive mind, or at least confuse it enough to create tactical opportunities..." What Peter didn't mention was that his spider sense was providing him with something unprecedented, early warning about a psychic entity's intentions. The Hive Tyrant's thoughts were alien and hostile, but they followed patterns that his precognitive abilities could interpret. It was like having advance notice of what the universe's most dangerous predator was planning to do next. He web-slinged directly toward the massive bioform, and the Hive Tyrant's response was immediate and violent. Psychic energy lanced out like invisible lightning, designed to shut down his nervous system and leave him helpless for consumption. "Oh wow," Peter said, spinning through the air as his spider sense guided him around the psychic assault. "That's some serious mental firepower. But you know what your problem is? You're thinking too linearly." The Hive Tyrant's alien intelligence processed this information and concluded that its prey was either insane or possessed of capabilities that didn't match any known Imperial classification. It adjusted its attack patterns accordingly, which was exactly what Peter had been hoping for. See, the thing about hive minds is that they're really good at coordinating large numbers of simple organisms, but they have trouble adapting to truly unpredictable individual behavior. You're trying to process me like I'm just another Imperial soldier, but I'm not following any tactical doctrine you've ever encountered. To demonstrate his point, Peter began moving in ways that violated every principle of military engagement the Tyranids had learned over millions of years of galactic consumption. He attacked from angles that shouldn't exist, retreated through dimensions that the hive mind hadn't accounted for, and maintained a constant stream of commentary that was apparently confusing the alien intelligence on a fundamental level. Plus, he added, firing his bolt pistol while hanging upside down from a web line attached to the Hive Tyrant's own crest, "I don't think you're used to prey that talks back. Most of the people you eat are probably too busy screaming or praying or trying to run away to provide constructive feedback about your performance." The Hive Tyrant's psychic shriek of frustration was felt by every Tyranid organism within a 50-kilometer radius, and the swarm's coordination began to falter as their central processor struggled to categorize a threat that seemed to operate on principles of applied chaos theory. "Brothers," Peter called out over the comm, "I think I've got its attention. Now would be a really good time for that coordinated fire support we discussed." "Engaging," Captain Thaddeus replied, and the Crimson Fists opened up with everything they had. But Peter's spider sense was already telling him that the real challenge was just beginning.
The coordinated assault that followed was the kind of tactical masterpiece that gets studied in military academies for centuries, assuming anyone survived to write the after-action reports. Captain Thaddeus had taken Peter's analysis of the Tyranid coordination network and turned it into a precision strike plan that targeted synapse creatures with surgical efficiency. Brother Sergeant Huron was leading flanking maneuvers that exploited gaps in the swarm's formation, and the entire Crimson Fist strike force was operating with the kind of fluid coordination that made seasoned veterans look like artists of war. But what elevated the engagement from professionally competent to absolutely legendary was Peter Parker treating the entire battle like the galaxy's most elaborate team-building exercise. "Okay, everyone, remember what we practiced," Peter called out over the tactical channel while web-slinging between Carnifex bioforms like a one-man aerial circus. "Brother Maximus, you've got the high ground advantage on that ridge. Use it to provide overwatch for Brother Cassius's advance. Brother Huron, there's a cluster of warrior organisms at your 2 o'clock that are coordinating the Hormigaunt swarms. If you can take them out, their formations will collapse." "How can you see all that from your position?" Huron asked, systematically eliminating the targets Peter had identified with the efficiency of a professional exterminator. "Spider sense plus enhanced pattern recognition plus way too much coffee this morning. Also, I'm getting really good at reading Tyranid body language. Did you know that Hormagaunts do this little head twitch thing right before they charge? It's actually kind of adorable." What was making the coordination so effective wasn't just Peter's tactical awareness. It was his complete inability to treat warfare as anything other than an elaborate group activity, where everyone needed to work together to solve increasingly complex problems. He provided running commentary on enemy movements, suggested tactical adjustments in real time, and somehow managed to make coordinated combat feel like the most natural thing in the galaxy. "Captain Thaddeus, if you can get your squad to that collapsed building at bearing 270, you'll have a perfect crossfire position with Brother Sergeant Huron's team," Peter announced, currently engaged in what could only be described as aerial tag with a hive tyrant that was becoming increasingly frustrated with its inability to catch him. "Confirmed," Thaddeus replied, moving his Marines into position with the kind of tactical precision that came from months of learning to trust Peter's battlefield analysis. "All units, converge on the Synapse cluster for the Emperor and Dorn. And for better interspecies cooperation through superior teamwork," Peter added, delivering a bolt pistol shot that took out a Tyranid warrior's head in a spray of ichor. The Hive Tyrant, meanwhile, was discovering that 10 million years of evolutionary perfection hadn't prepared it for an opponent who treated combat like a collaborative sport. Every time it adapted to Peter's movement patterns, he would change tactics entirely. When it tried to coordinate swarm attacks, Peter would disrupt the formations by eliminating key organisms. And when it attempted to use its psychic abilities to crush his mind, Peter would respond with observations about its technique that suggested he was grading its performance. "You know," Peter said, web-slinging around the massive creature's head while it tried to track him with 4 different sets of eyes, "for a supposedly perfect biological killing machine, you're really having trouble with basic target acquisition. Have you considered that maybe evolution optimized you for fighting armies, not individuals? Because I've got to tell you, your anti-personnel protocols could use some work." The Hive Tyrant's response was a psychic shriek of pure rage that temporarily disrupted synapse connections across the entire battlefield. "Ooh, hit a nerve there," Peter observed. "Let me guess, you're used to being the biggest, scariest thing on any battlefield, and having someone treat you like a really large puzzle instead of an unstoppable force of nature is messing with your self-image." What Peter couldn't see, but his battle brothers were witnessing with growing amazement, was that his running psychological analysis of the Hive Tyrant was having a measurable effect on the entire swarm. Tyranid coordination was based on absolute confidence in the superiority of their biological design. Having that confidence systematically questioned by someone who was simultaneously impossible to catch was creating what could only be described as an identity crisis on a species level. "Brother Parker," Captain Thaddeus called out, "whatever you're doing to their command structure, it's working. Swarm cohesion is down 30% and falling."
"Oh, that's just basic cognitive behavioral therapy," Peter replied, currently using the Hive Tyrant's own crest as an anchor point while it tried to figure out how he'd gotten above it. Sometimes you just need to help someone or something recognize that their core beliefs might not be as unshakable as they thought. It's very therapeutic. You're providing therapy to a Hive Tyrant? Technically, I'm providing therapy to an entire Hive fleet through their primary synapse node. It's like couples counseling, but with more explosions and fewer payment plans. The battle reached its climax when Peter managed to webline the Hive Tyrant to a collapsing industrial structure, while simultaneously coordinating fire from 6 different Space Marine squads. The alien intelligence found itself trapped, confused, and facing the unprecedented experience of having its evolutionary superiority questioned by someone who wouldn't stop making jokes about its parenting skills. And that, Peter announced, as the Hive Tyrant collapsed under concentrated bolter fire, is what we call successful conflict resolution through applied teamwork and inappropriate humor. The silence that followed was only broken by the distant sounds of the remaining Tyranid organisms wandering around in circles, their coordination network having suffered what could only be described as a philosophical breakdown. "Status report," Captain Thaddeus requested. "Swarm neutralized, morale significantly improved, and I think we just proved that the power of friendship and superior firepower can overcome any obstacle. Also, I'm pretty sure we just became the first Imperial force in history to defeat Tyranids through group therapy. Is that going to be in your official report?" "Oh, absolutely. The Codex Astartes is about to get a very interesting addendum."
The command briefing aboard the Defiant Valor 3 weeks later would have been a perfectly standard post-campaign analysis, complete with tactical assessments, casualty reports, and recommendations for future engagements. What made it unusual was that half the assembled Space Marines were trying very hard not to smile, while the other half had given up the pretense entirely and were listening to Scout Brother Parker's mission debrief with expressions of barely contained amusement. "Let me understand this correctly," Chapter Master Cantor said, reviewing the data slate that contained what was officially being called the most comprehensive after-action report in chapter history. "In the space of 3 weeks, you have defeated an Orc Wa through interpretive acrobatics, provided psychological counseling to a Chaos Sorcerer, turned our fortress-monastery into a 3-dimensional web complex, conducted real-time tactical consulting for 3 different armies simultaneously, and performed group therapy on a Hive Tyrant?" "That's a fair summary," Peter replied, standing at attention with the kind of military bearing that would have been perfect if not for the fact that he was still wearing his red and blue color scheme instead of regulation Crimson Fist's heraldry. Although I prefer to think of it as exploring innovative approaches to conflict resolution through enhanced battlefield mobility and strategic application of humor. Master of Sanctity Grimaldus made a note on his data slate. In the past month, he'd been forced to create entirely new categories for Peter's activities, including therapeutic heresy, constructive insubordination, and doctrinally questionable but tactically sound. "Your influence on the chapter has been," Cantor paused, searching for words that would be both accurate and diplomatic. "Measurable." That was putting it mildly. In the weeks since Peter's integration into the chapter, several concerning developments had emerged. Brother Sergeant Huron had been observed making what could only be described as tactical jokes during combat operations. Scout Brother Maximus had begun questioning established protocols in ways that were technically within regulations, but philosophically troubling. And the entire 10th Company had started approaching warfare with what Chaplain Grimaldus was forced to classify as inappropriate enthusiasm. Most disturbing of all,
casualty rates had dropped by 40%, while mission success rates had increased by 67%. "Brother Parker," Chaplain Grimaldus said, his skull-faced helmet somehow conveying disapproval despite being an inanimate object. "Your methods, while effective, raise serious questions about doctrinal compliance. The Codex Astartes does not include provisions for psychological warfare conducted through comedy." "Maybe it should," suggested Brother Cassius, then immediately looked surprised that he'd spoken aloud. The silence that followed was the kind usually reserved for moments when someone had said something that couldn't be unsaid. "I mean," Cassius continued, apparently deciding that if he was going to commit heresy, he might as well be thorough about it. "Brother Parker's approaches are unorthodox, but they achieve mission objectives with minimal casualties and maximum efficiency. Isn't that what we're supposed to be doing?" "The means matter as much as the ends," Grimaldus replied, though his tone suggested he was having this argument with himself as much as with anyone else. "We are Space Marines. We are supposed to be grim, resolute, and unwavering in our devotion to duty." "But are we supposed to be effective?" asked Scout Brother Maximus, which is exactly the kind of question that made chaplains reach for their strongest incense. Chapter Master Cantor watched this theological debate with the expression of someone who had commanded Space Marines for 4 centuries and thought he'd seen everything. Peter Parker had been with them for less than a month, and already his battle brothers were asking questions that struck at the heart of what it meant to be an Astartes. "Brother Parker," Cantor said finally, "what is your assessment of your integration into the chapter?" Peter considered the question with the kind of careful thought he usually reserved for complex physics problems. "Honestly, sir, I think you guys take yourselves way too seriously. I mean, you're incredibly good at what you do, probably the most professional soldiers I've ever worked with, but you've built this whole identity around being grim and humorless, and I'm not sure it's actually helping you be more effective." "Explain." "Well, stress and fear reduce tactical efficiency. Rigid thinking makes it harder to adapt to changing battlefield conditions, and treating every engagement like it's a funeral makes it difficult to maintain the kind of creative problem-solving that wins wars." Peter gestured to his assembled battle brothers. "But when people are relaxed, confident, and actually enjoying what they're doing, they perform better. They take calculated risks, they support each other more effectively, and they're more likely to find innovative solutions to impossible problems. You're suggesting that humor makes us better warriors. I'm suggesting that being human makes you better warriors. Even superhuman warriors are still human at core, and humans work better when they're not constantly trying to suppress every positive emotion in the name of professional grimness." Master of Sanctity Grimaldus looked at his notes, which contained casualty statistics that couldn't be argued with and efficiency ratings that spoke louder than any theological objection. "Chapter Master," he said finally, "I request permission to conduct a formal study on the tactical applications of morale enhancement through unconventional means." "Granted," Cantor replied, then looked directly at Peter. "Brother Parker, you will continue your current duties with the Scout Company. However, I'm also assigning you to work with our chaplains on developing new training protocols that incorporate your unique perspective on warfare." "Really?" Peter's face lit up with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for Christmas morning. "Can I suggest some improvements to the hypno-indoctrination process? Because I have some ideas about making it more interactive and less psychologically traumatic." "Within reason," Cantor said quickly, before Grimaldus could have a complete theological breakdown. "This is going to be great," Peter announced. "We're going to revolutionize Space Marine training. Just wait until you see what we can accomplish when we combine 10,000 years of military excellence with a little bit of creativity and a lot more fun. Around the briefing table, the assembled Space Marines exchanged glances that suggested the future was going to be very interesting indeed.
6 months later, the Crimson Fists had become something unprecedented in the annals of Space Marine history, a chapter that other Astartes actually wanted to visit. Not because they needed assistance, though the Fists' combat effectiveness had reached levels that made other chapter masters quietly request copies of their training protocols, but because word had spread throughout the Imperium of a chapter that had somehow managed to maintain their legendary professionalism while discovering something that had been missing from Space Marine doctrine for 10 millennia: joy. Peter Parker stood on the observation deck of the Defiant Valor, watching new recruits go through what was now officially called Enhanced Tactical Training with Integrated Morale Optimization. What it actually looked like was a group of future Space Marines learning to web swing between training obstacles, while Chaplain Grimaldus provided running commentary that included both proper battlefield doctrine and what could only be described as constructive encouragement. "Remember, aspirants," Grimaldus called out, his skull-faced helmet somehow managing to convey paternal pride. "The Emperor protects, but proper anchor point selection and angular momentum conservation will keep you from falling to your death. Brother Parker, demonstrate the tactical applications of the inverted approach vector." "You got it, chappie," Peter replied, web-slinging through the training course with the fluid grace that had become his signature. "The key is thinking three-dimensionally, guys. Most enemies expect attacks from horizontal planes, so coming at them from above or below gives you tactical advantage plus the element of surprise." What amazed Peter most wasn't how well his fellow Space Marines had adapted to his unconventional methods. Though watching Brother Sergeant Huron deliver tactical briefings while hanging upside down from the ceiling never got old, it was how much more effective they'd become when they stopped treating warfare like a grim duty and started approaching it like a challenging sport they were really good at. "Status report from the Mordian 7 campaign," Peter asked Captain Thaddeus, who was reviewing tactical displays with the kind of satisfied expression usually reserved for people whose hobbies had become profitable. "Complete success," Thaddeus replied. "The Tau diplomatic envoy was so impressed by our innovative approach to conflict resolution that they've requested formal tactical exchanges. Apparently, our combination of superior firepower and inappropriate humor during negotiations convinced them we were either insane enough to be dangerous or confident enough to be respected." And the orc situation? Resolved through what the official reports are calling aggressive pest control with educational commentary. The war boss was so confused by your running critique of his strategic planning that he forgot to fight back effectively. His surviving knobs are apparently still arguing whether humans are supposed to be that bouncy. Peter grinned, watching the newest batch of scout recruits attempt their first coordinated web swing maneuvers. They were getting better, not just at the acrobatics, but at the mental flexibility that made them more adaptable warriors. When you learn to navigate three-dimensional combat environments while maintaining tactical awareness and providing mutual support, traditional ground-based warfare started to seem almost simple by comparison. "Any word from Terra about our doctrinal innovations?" Peter asked. "The Codex Review Board is still processing our submissions, though I understand that several other chapters have quietly requested copies of our training materials. The Imperial Fists are particularly interested in our enhanced fortification defense through structural web networks protocols." What neither of them mentioned, because it was still too new and strange to discuss openly, was that the Crimson Fists had somehow become the chapter that other Imperial forces actually looked forward to working with. Their reputation for competence had always preceded them, but now it was combined with something that had been missing from Imperial military culture for so long that most people had forgotten it was possible. The sense that defending humanity could be something you did with pride and even happiness, rather than grim resignation. "Brother Parker," came Chapter Master Cantor's voice over the comm system, "we have a situation that requires your unique perspective." Peter web slung through the ship's corridors with the casual efficiency that had become second nature.
arriving at the command bridge to find the senior staff gathered around a tactical display showing a system under siege by what appeared to be every hostile force in the local sector. Multiple threat assessment, Cantor explained without preamble. Multiple threat assessment, Chaos Incursion, Tyrannid Splinter Fleet, and an Orc Wa, all converging on the same system. The local Imperial Guard commander is requesting immediate assistance, but conventional doctrine suggests this is a strategic retreat situation. Peter studied the tactical display, his enhanced pattern recognition parsing the complex threat matrix with the kind of analytical precision that would have made a Khajiit jealous. But what he saw wasn't an impossible situation, it was an incredibly complex problem that just needed the right kind of creative solution. You know what this reminds me of? Remember that three-way firefight on Mordian 7, except with higher stakes and more participants? We've got multiple hostile forces who don't like each other any more than they like us. The tactical solution is the same. Get them focused on fighting each other while we protect the civilians and accomplish our actual objectives. That's not a standard engagement protocol, observed Master of Sanctity Grimaldus, though his tone suggested he was interested rather than disapproving. No, Peter agreed, but it's a very effective non-standard engagement protocol. Plus, think about it. We'd be going into a situation where our unconventional tactics would be most valuable, where our ability to adapt and improvise would give us maximum advantage, and where our enhanced morale and unit cohesion would make the biggest difference. Chapter Master Cantor looked around at his assembled officers, reading the subtle signs of anticipation and confidence that had become characteristic of the Crimson Fists under Peter's influence. Their battle brothers weren't just willing to attempt an impossible mission, they were looking forward to it. "Set course for the Voldris system," he commanded, "and prepare for full deployment. We are going to show the galaxy what happens when Space Marines remember that protecting humanity is supposed to be the greatest honor in the Imperium." "Sir, yes, sir," the answer came from every throat in the command bridge, delivered with the kind of enthusiasm that would have worried chaplains 6 months ago, but now just made them proud. As the Defiant Valor entered the warp, Peter looked out at the swirling energies of unreality and felt his spider sense settle into the familiar rhythm that meant interesting challenges ahead. The 41st millennium was still grim and dark, but somewhere in that darkness, the Crimson Fists were proving that even the longest night could be made brighter by warriors who remembered how to smile.
In the grim darkness of the far future, there are 1,000 ways to serve the Emperor, and Peter Parker had found one that nobody had written in any manual. The Crimson Fists had discovered something that 10,000 years of warfare had nearly erased from Space Marine culture, that protecting humanity didn't have to mean abandoning your humanity. That duty could be joyful, that brotherhood could include laughter, and that sometimes the most effective way to face the darkness was to carry your own light. The galaxy was still burning. Chaos still sought to corrupt, Xenos still threatened Imperial worlds, and heretics still plotted against the master of mankind. But in one small corner of that vast darkness, a chapter of Space Marines had learned that hope wasn't a weakness, it was a weapon. That humor wasn't frivolity, it was armor against despair, and that sometimes the most effective way to face the darkness was to carry your own light. The Emperor protects, the ancient saying went, but sometimes, Peter had learned, the Emperor protects by sending someone who remembers that protection isn't just about killing enemies, it's about preserving everything worth saving about the people you're protecting, including their ability to hope, to laugh, and to believe that tomorrow might actually be better than today. In the end, perhaps that was the most revolutionary idea of all, that in the grim darkness of the far future, there could still be room for a friendly neighborhood Space Marine who never forgot that with great power comes great responsibility, and that responsibility included making sure the people you served remembered why life was worth living. The web of hope Peter Parker had woven among the Crimson Fists was spreading one battle brother at a time, one mission at a time, one moment of shared laughter at a time,
And in a galaxy where despair was a weapon and hope was a mark of heresy, that might just be enough to change everything.